invisible killer is sweeping the world.
If it spreads unchecked, it's going to be a lot worse.
A pandemic now underway.
I am officially declaring a national emergency.
In a matter of weeks, COVID-19 has changed life as we know it.
I think we're kind of beyond the stage of worry.
Worldwide, tens of thousands are dead, hundreds of thousands infected. And now, borders closed, schools shut down, cities on lockdown, and the global economy is at risk.
The economy was moving along just fine, and this, boom, we get hit from the outside.
Past the point of containment, the virus continues to spread.
A vaccine is unlikely to be available in the next 12 months.
How did we get here?
The truth is that we know a lot about these kind of viruses, and it was kind of waiting to happen.
And when and how will this crisis end?
We are in a real fog of war moment. The question is, how big is it going to be? How out of control is it going to get?
There could be other diseases that will emerge in the future. This is not the last one.
America is in turmoil as a never-before-seen virus, COVID-19, sweeps across the country.
All 54 states, territories, and the District of Columbia have declared a state of emergency.
As the nation reels from the rapid spread of the disease and the severe measures being undertaken to stop it, a shocking new reality sets in.
We are 2 weeks or 3 weeks away from running out of the supplies we need most for our hospitals.
It was like drowning on dry land.
We direct a statewide order for people to stay at home.
COVID-19 is thought to have crept into the U.S. through one man from Seattle just 2 months ago. But the story of this pandemic begins across the globe weeks before. December 19th, 2019, a mysterious disease appears in the Chinese city of Wuhan, with a population of 11 million, the largest city in Hubei province.
The first thing we saw was a photo that had been posted on Twitter, and it said that there had been a number of cases of atypical pneumonia occurring in that city.
A cluster of individuals had presented with severe respiratory distress, and some had died.
Local doctors suspect that something is very wrong in the city.
When you normally treat 10 cases of pneumonia a week and you're suddenly treating 50, you realize something's going on here.
Finding a link between patients is key to unlocking the mystery.
20-something cases had visited the Huanan seafood market, and so it was believed that this particular outbreak had something to do with that market.
A new killer is on the loose.
An entirely new pathogen, something that's completely unlike anything we've seen before.
And the timing couldn't be worse. It's Chinese New Year, the biggest annual celebration in the country. Travelers come and go from all corners of the world, and many of them are, or will soon be, unknowing carriers of a terrifying new disease. Scientists think this could be a new outbreak of SARS, a highly lethal respiratory infection that struck down thousands in 2003. If this new outbreak is anywhere near as contagious, the impact globally could be alarming.
Anytime you have a virus that is somewhat lethal, but highly transmissible, it has the potential to reach millions and millions and millions of people.
Initially, the Chinese authorities are slow to take action to contain the outbreak, even though doctors on the front line are sounding the alarm.
Dr. Li Wenliang tried to warn some of his colleagues that something's going on here, it's quite worrisome, watch out, try to protect yourself. The government came down like a ton of bricks. Dr. Li was told to shut up. He was actually arrested and threatened with imprisonment. China took a sort of nothing to see here attitude.
But just 1 month after doctors first noticed symptoms, the outbreak is growing in intensity. with 201 cases and 3 deaths.
The lack of action characterized the early stage of the response. But after January 20th, we saw the government start to step in.
Over the next 2 days, infections triple, deaths rise 5-fold.
Things went crazy in China.
A few weeks into the crisis, China's response is simple.
Find every case, isolate them, stop the chains of transmission.
Chinese authorities begin to lock down the city of Wuhan.
They started to quarantine the entire Wuhan city, and that the quarantine measures also being expanded to the surrounding cities.
But the virus continues to wreak havoc in Wuhan.
People were queuing, lining up at hospitals trying to get treated. There were people in corridors. And there were, of course, reports of people who had died in their homes because they weren't allowed to go to the hospital. And there were a lot of scary images coming out in those early days.
Wuhan, under siege, day 3. I'm taking a walk outside.
American teacher Diana Adama documents the reality of life in Wuhan as the lockdown hits.
Everything's closed. Everything. No shops are open. No more good food.
There was this eeriness in the air, this feeling in the air. It just didn't seem normal. There were no cars at one point. I'm on the edge of the city, but there was like nothing.
This was half full before.
Sunday morning, it hit me. What's going on? What's happening? What is this virus? Where did it come from? I went to hospitals looking for the foreign people. Sorry.
As the Chinese authorities lock down the city of 11 million people, their strategy assumes that only a victim showing obvious symptoms like fever and a cough will spread the virus. This will turn out to be a serious error.
The worst possible scenario is if you have people who are spreading virus, even though they don't have symptoms themselves. They don't know they're sick, so they don't know that they should self-isolate. They don't know that they should seek help. And there they are out in the community spreading the virus.
As more cases begin showing up in other big cities in China, like Beijing, a city with roughly 20 million people, it's clear the strategy in Wuhan has failed. By January 19th, the virus is finally identified. It's a new type of what's called coronavirus, a varied group of viruses first identified in the mid-1960s, known to cause symptoms as simple as a common cold to very dangerous and deadly respiratory ailments. And now it's appearing throughout Asia, in Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Japan, all countries within traveling distance of Wuhan. And it is about to reach America.
On the 19th of January, in Washington State, a man, 35 years old, developed some worrying symptoms, took himself to his local doctor, and was ultimately diagnosed with the first case of coronavirus in the United States.
4 days earlier, he had returned from a trip to Wuhan. He insists he hadn't come into contact with anyone who is ill. Uncertainty about how the virus is transmitted continues to grow. And the U.S. is totally unprepared for the catastrophe that's about to unfold.
We are in a real fog of war moment. The question is, how big is it going to be? How out of control is it going to get?
The end of January 2020 sees shocking global news. A new coronavirus, referred to as a novel coronavirus as it is unique to its class, has now spread across 4 continents. There are over 1,500 new cases emerging every day, with scientists working 24/7 to figure out what they're dealing with. The World Health Organization declares a global health emergency.
The novel coronavirus outbreak is a public health emergency of international concern.
How is the virus moving so quickly? An outbreak on a cruise ship shows just how dangerous the virus can be in a dense population. In mid-January, the Diamond Princess cruise ship sails off from the Japanese port of Yokohama to Hong Kong. With 2,700 passengers and 1,000 crew members, Rebecca and Kent Frazier from the U.S. are among those sailing on the 14-day voyage, excited for the trip of a lifetime.
We're enjoying the ports that we went into. We met a lot of really fun people on board and made some good friends.
It was super fun.
Another passenger is an 80-year-old man who leaves the boat in Hong Kong 5 days into the journey because he's ill. He is hospitalized and diagnosed with the disease, but the ship is already back at sea. On the advice of Japanese medical professionals, the ship is locked into quarantine for 14 days.
They boarded the ship and went door to door, testing everybody's temperature.
After 2 days of quarantine, a health screening reveals that Rebecca has the virus.
We found out this morning that 41 more people had been tested positive for coronavirus. And come to find out that I was one of those 41 people.
Within an hour, she is taken off the ship and placed in an isolation ward at a Japanese hospital.
Yeah, fun times. So, anyway, this sucks.
It will be a month before Rebecca is given the all clear and allowed to leave the hospital to rejoin her husband, Kent.
USA.
By the time the quarantine is lifted, a total of 7 people die, and around 700 test positive for the virus. Without isolation and quarantine measures, scientists estimate the number infected could have been closer to 3,000.
What happened on the Diamond Princess was really scary, led to a lot of panic, led to a lot of news coverage. That showed us that the disease, under the right circumstances, can spread really quickly.
Scientists know that the novel coronavirus grabbing world attention belongs to a family of several different viruses, from the common cold to the deadly SARS. Most people have been in contact with some form of coronavirus in their lifetime, but this is a new strain. To fight it, more information is needed. And on February 11th, a team of scientists at the Department of Pathology in Beijing finally unraveled the DNA within the virus. Sharing 80% of its makeup with SARS, the disease is identified and named for the first time as COVID-19.
So viruses are little tiny bits of genetic information. They're packaged inside of a protective outer shell, and they basically infect cells and make copies of themselves. And they do this over and over, and when that happens, it can be damaging to the cells that they infect, and if that happens enough, it can cause disease.
A virus, people say sometimes, is a piece of bad news wrapped in protein. It is a vector for getting genetic information into a cell, and that genetic information just contains a blueprint to make more viruses. They were able to tell that although this virus was new, it was closely related to the original SARS virus.
The previous SARS epidemic was deadly, killing over 800 people in 8 months. But in just 3 months, COVID-19 has already infected over 200,000 people and claimed over 8,000 lives, making it over 20 times more deadly than SARS. Scientists are faced with the reality that this outbreak is much worse. Crucially, they need to find out how to efficiently diagnose and treat COVID-19. 80% of those infected will experience mild symptoms, typically starting with a high fever over 99.5 degrees. Other mild symptoms include a dry cough or aches and pains. But for a few, symptoms can become severe.
The way that COVID-19 causes disease is by infecting cells in what we call the lower respiratory system, so into your lungs. And that infection in your lower lungs causes a pneumonia, and that pneumonia makes it very difficult to breathe.
Around 1 in 10 need to be put on a respirator in order to survive. Those with underlying health conditions and the elderly are most at risk.
What's different about this virus is that a much higher percentage of people require hospitalization, and especially among older people, the mortality rate is much higher.
Recent statistics from China show that around 65% of their cases were over 40 years old. And so far, 15% of the victims over the age of 80 in China have died. Causes of death from COVID-19 include respiratory collapse, shock, or multiple organ failure. Preventing transmission is key to saving lives. Widespread behavior modifications are crucial.
Avoid large crowds. Avoid places where you're going to be in close contact with large numbers of other people.
As we touch surfaces and then touch our face, that is how we inoculate ourselves with these viruses. So keeping things clean is definitely helpful.
Alcohol, bleach, and even soap can kill it.
Wash your hands diligently with soap, right? Protecting yourself is also protecting other people.
But research shows that COVID-19 can survive for 24 hours on cardboard and 2 to 3 days on stainless steel and plastic. And despite all efforts, the novel COVID-19 is now spreading faster than we can contain it.
The best estimates are that the virus is doubling in numbers within communities in about, 6 to 8 days.
As COVID-19 spreads around the world, the race for a vaccine becomes more urgent with each day, as does the search for a cure.
Whenever there is a new virus, there is a lot of unknowns, and those unknowns take time to become knowns. Studying coronavirus, which is spreading explosively and is new, is an enormously difficult task.
So far, the virus is untreatable. A patient is only able to recover if their system can overcome the attack it's under. And like many viruses, COVID-19 is a formidable enemy.
Respiratory viruses have one aim, that is to get inside a human cell and use it as a factory to make thousands or millions of replacement copies that will then spread onto new cells. So often the cells will literally blow apart as the virus is producing its millions of progeny.
With viruses, it's much more challenging because mostly they use our own cells to make more viruses. And so they're using our own cellular machinery. We can't poison that without poisoning ourselves.
This is not a bacterial disease. Antibiotics only work against bacteria, so antibiotics will not have any impact on COVID-19.
For some in the scientific community, the seriousness of the situation is not a surprise.
Truth is that we know a lot about these kind of viruses. We know about the outbreaks, but what we're really lacking is sufficient funding to contain them. And it was kind of waiting to happen.
While many governments are slow to respond and coordinate, the international scientific community is not.
So in the middle of January, when there started to be a surge of cases in China, I made a phone call to Tom Friedrich and some of my colleagues and said,
do you think that we should study COVID-19? Basically, he was just like, yeah, let's do it. If he decided to do it, then I'm in too.
And so I said, well, let's start by just collecting expertise, and has led to several groups who are all working together, sharing protocols, sharing ideas of how they're going to study the coronavirus.
Scientists collaborate and share real-time research on a global scale like never before. This new virus is unknown territory, and that has them on high alert.
There's been really heroic efforts among Chinese clinicians and scientists once they recognized that they were dealing with something new.
Chinese scientists not only sequenced the virus, but they made those sequences publicly available so that scientists in the US and elsewhere could begin working on developing kits for diagnostics, can begin studying the virus and trying to understand it.
And there's some beautiful data out there tracking the gene sequences of COVID-19 viruses from across the world in real time.
Working around the clock, scientists are making huge advances. But creating safe and effective drugs takes time.
There's been a lot of confusion about the timeline for vaccine availability. And I think part of that has to do with the steps involved in making a vaccine. People are working in labs now to generate possible vaccines that we will then need to test. But there's a long road between that initial safety testing and you and me being able to go to the doctor and get a COVID-19 vaccine.
A vaccine for this virus is unlikely to be available in the next 12 months. What that means is these other sorts of preparedness measures need to be put into place because we're not going to have a vaccine. And so expecting this to be like the movie Contagion is simply unrealistic.
With a vaccine in the works, but at least a year away, focus shifts to our healthcare systems and their capacity for those who become seriously ill.
Some are going to require to be put on artificial ventilators or other really sophisticated machines to help support their breathing while they're trying to survive the disease.
But experts soon realize there may not be adequate resources, like respirators, needed to carry out basic life support.
If too many people get sick at one time, there aren't going to be enough of those machines.
The case fatality rate of COVID-19 is going to depend on a lot of factors and may actually vary geographically depending on the demographic of people who get infected, the capacity of the healthcare system, the ability to test people and detect their infection. And so our goal there is to make sure that we slow down the progression as much as possible, to make sure that we don't overburden the healthcare system.
And within weeks, this is exactly what happens in Europe, as Italy finds itself on the edge of a crisis.
Nella giornata di ieri è stato trasferito nel nostro istituto dalla struttura dedicata della città militare della Cecchignola un cittadino italiano di sesso maschile risultato già positivo al test di screening per nuovo coronavirus.
I think this is an important reminder that we live in an interconnected world where viruses that emerge anywhere in the world can be a threat to the entire world.
With COVID-19 seemingly spreading across the world, a once distant viral outbreak is getting closer to our shores. In the U.S., by the end of February, COVID-19 cases are on the rise in Washington State, Texas, and Florida. And news comes from Europe and the Middle East, showing that COVID-19 is a serious crisis. In northern Italy, new cases of the deadly virus are doubling every day. By March the 8th, 7,375 infections and 366 deaths are recorded. And fears of overwhelmed hospitals are realized. Reports surface of doctors having to choose who lives or dies because there aren't enough respirators. Realizing drastic measures are needed to stop further spread, the north of Italy goes into lockdown.
Northern Italy has been shut down, full quarantine or lockdown of that area. This is like the ultimate social distancing to lock down the city, give advice to stay at home.
Italy's crisis is soon followed by news from Iran that it is also overwhelmed by cases. and a spiraling death rate. American experts continue to look at past pandemics for clues for containment.
To be a pandemic, you really have to have shown global spread, and it has to be something that's causing disease. Okay, so it's an outbreak of a disease that has spread sufficiently across the world for people to be in peril.
The last pandemic to strike America was in 2009. The swine flu outbreak began in March in Mexico and hit America within a month. It infected 60 million U.S. citizens, put 250,000 people in the hospital, and killed 12,000.
When we had the 2009 outbreak, that virus was highly contagious and went through the globe very, very quickly, but it didn't cause severe disease in very many people. So in a sense, COVID-19 is blending the transmissibility of that flu with the severity of SARS.
The fact that COVID-19 is easily spread and so deadly makes it a major threat. Even taking public transportation can put you in the line of fire.
Well, you have necessity of transportation, but also wanting to create a barrier so you don't breathe in necessarily everything that's floating around.
We define close contact as 6 feet, and if you're within 6 feet of somebody who's symptomatic, it's possible to contract the infection.
The only thing that can slow the spread in our connected world is isolating those who are infected. To do that, tracking of the progress of the disease is essential. But is the United States prepared? In Washington state, there is a wake-up call. A nursing home reports an outbreak within its walls. None of the residents have been abroad. The virus is now spreading within their community.
Care home or hospital is absolutely the worst place to be if a virus hits. These people have no immunity to the virus. It's a brand new virus. And this can predispose you to much, much worse disease.
The nursing home staff appeal for virus test kits, but none are available. Starting in January, most of the world implements a test backed by the World Health Organization. But the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention insists on creating its own diagnostic test.
The idea was get it out there as quickly as you can and don't worry about the fine print. In the old days, if you wanted to develop a diagnostic test for a disease, it has to go through months and months of testing.
But some of the first tests made available in the U.S. are found to be faulty.
So it's not surprising that early tests that were rushed out were not completely foolproof. If you look at the Washington state situation, estimates that that virus that cropped up eventually had been circulating for weeks undetected.
By March 11th, 118,000 cases of COVID-19 have been found in 114 countries, and 4,291 people have lost their lives. The World Health Organization confirms a pandemic. Containment has already failed.
There are cases on every continent except for Antarctica. The virus is spreading all over the world.
Scientists tracking this increasingly global threat continue investigating its origins. During the 2003 SARS epidemic, scientists discovered bats in caves near the origin city were carrying a strain of coronavirus. They hypothesized that the virus made human contact through animal markets and mutated into SARS.
In the family tree of coronaviruses, there are a lot of different bat coronaviruses, but there are only a few different human coronaviruses. Coronaviruses are ultimately bat viruses that find their way into humans.
And sure enough, as Chinese scientists compare the original cases of SARS and the new coronavirus outbreak, there's a striking connection.
The outbreak appeared to have originated in a wild food market where there are a lot of exotic animals.
At the wet animal market in Wuhan, several exotic species are slaughtered on site, including bats. One particular species, belonging to the horseshoe bat family is known to be infected with a particular strain of the coronavirus.
The normal circulating strain in the bats probably isn't causing much of a disease, but when it reaches humans, that's when all havoc breaks out because it's in a new environment.
It's not uncommon for a virus to cross between species. Over half of the world's known infectious diseases spread from animals to humans.
In the 20th century, virus that infects monkeys and great apes in Africa, called simian immunodeficiency virus, or SIV, jumped into people and started an outbreak that became what we now know as HIV. It came from multiple species of monkeys and apes, but we know that there's lots of other species of monkeys in Africa that also have simian immunodeficiency viruses that don't infect humans and have not been shown to cause disease in people. So that underscores the fact that it does happen, and the consequences can be significant, but it doesn't happen all the time with every virus that could conceivably jump between species. Ebola is also thought to be an example of a zoonotic virus likely spread from bats.
Viruses like this haunt our increasingly populated world. This new coronavirus, COVID-19, might create the full-blown pandemic scientists have long predicted.
We have to treat every epidemic as if it's the big one, and this might actually be the big one.
By early March, it's clear that international efforts to stop the spread of the deadly COVID-19 virus have failed. For a virus that started in one province of China, in a matter of weeks, it now spans all 6 continents. Identifying the cases through diagnostic testing is essential for managing and ultimately stopping the outbreak. But the United States testing strategy lags behind other countries like South Korea and Singapore.
The diagnostic test is pretty much the main weapon in our arsenal to prevent onward spread. You need to identify who's been exposed, you need to trace all their contacts, and everybody has to be tested very quickly.
In the U.S., a severe shortage of tests early on means that important weeks are lost. As the CDC finally approves a reliable test kit, the White House attempts to reassure the country.
Anybody right now and yesterday, anybody that needs a test gets a test. They're there. They have the test.
But with demand high, there are test shortages around the country. At the beginning of March, the U.S. had the lowest rate of coronavirus testing per capita of any developed country.
It's a huge failure. The situation in the United States was really inexcusable and highly counterproductive and extremely dangerous.
Because tests are in such short supply, the criteria to get one is stringent.
When you can't diagnose, you don't know who's going to fall sick, that's a bad news story.
It's been a little slow scaling it up, testing only people who have had contact with somebody who's traveled and with symptoms or traveled themselves to a high-risk country. So there probably are people who are infected and we're not aware of their infection.
We are more prepared now, but we're still not as prepared as we need to be. If we're not talking about containing a pandemic, I think we're talking about mitigating its severity.
The United States is in the early phases of this epidemic. It's clear that the testing has not been as extensive as in other countries. So we're now seeing outbreaks, and I am sure that this is only going to continue. I think this is just the very beginning of the curve for the United States. We don't really know what's going to happen, but I would predict a lot more cases in the coming weeks.
Uncertainty about the spread of the disease triggers panic. As sickness spreads, factories and businesses around the world feel the effects. Workers become sick. Governments mandate store and restaurant closures. And the global and U.S. economies face brutal consequences.
We have not seen anything like this in modern times. COVID-19, I think, is a stress test for the global economy in a lot of ways. Most systems are built for a reasonable range of scenarios. COVID-19 is not necessarily within that range.
The international stock markets are quick to react. On March 12th, the Dow Jones suffers its single biggest drop since 1987's Black Monday.
This could result in a public health 9/11, where no matter how many cases we have, we're going to see effects on the economy and on society that are going to be much larger than the impacts of the virus itself.
Supply chains from China begin to shut down. And the travel sector soon feels the stress as the panicked public cancels vacations and business trips. Airlines announce route cancellations, and the industry is forced to seek $50 billion in financial aid from the U.S. government.
Travel and tourism sector is 10% of the global economy. And it's not just 10%. So for every $1 spent in travel and tourism, another 72 cents of economic activity is generated. So it has big indirect effects.
The coronavirus fallout is suddenly felt at the most local level. Within a 48-hour period, colleges are closed, festivals and conferences are canceled. Businesses shift to work from home. And as experts issue warnings to avoid crowds, shoppers and diners stay home.
You're going to see more business failures, rapid rise of the unemployment, and that could lead to a serious global recession.
In an attempt to curb the economic decline, the Trump administration announces plans to send relief funds to every household. But supply chain concerns mean that money may not be able to secure the medicine and supplies needed to survive this pandemic.
What happens with this viral infection is that the lung gets damaged, and then you're susceptible to bacterial, what we call secondary or super infections, which can be treated with antibiotics. But if you can't get them because of the disrupted supply chain, then that patient's likely to die.
U.S. pharmaceutical firms, they don't have more than like 3 or 4 months of supply, in terms of stock. We are already facing this potential shortage. According to FDA, one drug is already a supply shortage problem.
A new era of uncertainty and panic descends upon the world. With no timeline for when it will all end and what life will be like when it does.
The question is, will banks put a pause on loans? Will your landlord put a pause on rent? Then we really just have to basically survive our life in our homes, not spreading the infection. And then when somebody pushed play again on the economy, we would all go back to exactly how we were before.
But no one yet knows what lies ahead with this pandemic. By mid-March 2020, the entire world is reeling from the impact of COVID-19. The news seems to get worse every day.
I think that it would be a mistake to think that whatever happens in our country and the rest of the world, that it will be over in a couple of weeks.
Is it too late to prevent the virus from running its course?
It's going to take a while for people to resign to the fact that we are now living with a new strain of a virus that we don't have a vaccine for yet.
Efforts to contain the virus thus far seem to have failed. Official estimates predict a worst case of 70 to 80% of the American population becoming infected. With a 1 to 2% fatality rate, that could mean almost 6 million Americans may die. How do we stop that nightmare from becoming an eventuality?
We hear health officials today talk, their aim is largely to flatten the curve. And what they mean by that is instead of the number of infections going way, way, way up and then coming down, they want to flatten it out a little bit. Still the same number of people end up getting infected, but it's over a longer period of time.
Flattening the curve is crucial. When a virus is past the point of containment, Slowing its spread is the only way to allow for limited resources to be available to every patient.
Among the people who are hospitalized, some of them are going to need really advanced intensive care unit support. There's not going to be enough doctors and people trained to support those individuals. And so if we can spread the disease out over several months, we give everyone the best chance of having access to those machines and access to that advanced support.
Today I am officially declaring a national emergency. Two very big words. The action I am taking will open up access to up to $50 billion.
To flatten the curve, dire measures are enacted across the U.S. Schools are closed, athletic seasons canceled. In some states, bars and restaurants are shuttered.
Per our mayor's request, we will be closed until further notice. We deeply care and respect the well-being of our community.
All over the country, people are heeding warnings to radically change their daily lives.
We live in a free society. The government can encourage you to social distance. They can encourage you not to participate in large gatherings, but ultimately it's up to the individual.
The search for a vaccine and cure is ongoing, with estimates of 12 to 18 months until it is available. But by then, how much damage will be done?
The outbreak in the United States surely will get worse. I think we're kind of beyond the stage of worry.
We need to be prepared at least that we are going to have a large number of infections. We are going to have a sizable number of people who die of this, and that this is something that we are going to be talking about a decade or two from now.
Scientists and medical doctors are doing everything they can, and there's a glimmer of hope. Drugs developed to treat other deadly viruses could offer promise in the treatment of COVID-19.
There's been interest in repurposing remdesivir, which was initially developed for Ebola virus. It does appear to be having some promising effects. There are now some clinical trials gearing up. There's some in China, there's one in Nebraska.
Once the virus penetrates a host cell, it is able to replicate itself over and over again. The virus's ability to replicate could also be the key to shutting it down. Drugs like remdesivir are designed to disrupt the virus at the molecular level, break up this replication process, and relieve the worst effects of the disease.
They're called chain terminators. They prevent the virus from extending the blueprint and making lots and lots of copies. So if you don't have copies of your genetic material, you can't make copies of the virus, and they're just dead in the water.
For Dr. Anthony Fauci, National Institutes of Health lead on the White House Coronavirus Task Force, drug trials like these offer hope.
Therapeutics. There are a number of antiviral drugs that are being tested, which means that we will know reasonably soon whether it works. And if it does, we will then have an effective therapy to distribute.
Americans and humans in general are resilient and adaptive. We will get through this.
And now it's our time. We must sacrifice together because we are all in this together and we'll come through together.
This outbreak accomplishes nothing else. It should be to remind people how fearsome these sorts of diseases can be.
Even with this unprecedented effort, there's still so much we don't know. We don't know if we will control this outbreak and that will be the last we ever see of COVID-19, or it may establish itself in the human population as influenza viruses have. And we have no idea right now just what might happen.